Hello, I'm Edward Lucas and I'm the Lib Dem prospective parliamentary candidate for central London, the cities of London and Westminster, which is the heart of the history of the LGBT community and a place where we are celebrating the History Month, where we look back at some of the great struggles of the past. But today I'm casting my glance and gaze across the Atlantic to my friend Jamie Kirchick, who has finished a book which is about to be published on the history of Washington, D.C., the American capital, secret city. Jamie, it's great to have you here, at least electronically, soon I hope in atomic form. Your book uncovers the history of the heart of power in Washington, going back to the very founding of the American Republic, but an aspect that for many people will be utterly unfamiliar, despite having really deep roots in the very beginning. So tell me, how did you come on the idea for the book? I know you live in Washington, but what was the prompt that got you off on this journey?
Well, I had always been interested in the Cold War. That was really my academic interest. I studied at Yale under Professor John Gaddis, who's the Dean of Cold War Studies. He wrote the biography of George Kennan, the great Cold War strategist. I lived in Berlin, the heart of the Cold War. And so many of the books and the movies that I watched all were sort of about espionage in the Cold War period of American history. And the more I was reading, the more I realized that there was this sort of invisible thread that went through all these stories and eras, which was sort of the secrecy of homosexuality. And sort of as a gay person, I was interested in this because I would see it in the background. I'd see characters, I'd see references to it, but no one had ever really put it all together. And if you think of the Cold War, you think of secrets. If you think of Washington, you think of secrets, of secrecy, of being a form of power, being an instrument of power. And during this period, there was no worse secret than homosexuality.
It was as worse to be a homosexual, as they've said then, than to be a communist.
Yes. In the sense that a communist could not become a communist. They could change, right? A communist could see the light. And many of the great American conservatives were former communists. But if you were a homosexual, that was it. You were condemned for the rest of your life. No one would trust you. You were a criminal. You were morally condemned. You were medically condemned. You were considered psychologically unfit. And then during the Cold War period, as I show in the book, you were also seen as being a traitor, not only being susceptible to blackmail, but also being sort of ideologically simpatico with America's enemies.
It's not just a story of persecution and repression. It's also a story of extraordinary heroic resistance and campaigning. And you have wonderful pen portraits. I love the obese albino and the stubborn astronomer and these characters. So obviously these people passed away a long time ago, but you must have felt you were getting to know them as friends as you plotted their extraordinary stories of resistance.
Yeah, and when you really think about it, these were people who were more patriotic than the average American, right? Because they wanted to serve a country that didn't want their service. I mean, you had all these gay people who were prevented from working for the government because in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower signed an executive order that prohibited gay people from serving in any federal government job, not just security clearance jobs. You couldn't even be a veterinarian at the National Zoo if you were gay. And these people all wanted to serve their country and they were denied the opportunity to do so. And yet they fought to overcome that. And that to me is just so inspiring.
Give us a couple of quick pen portraits of these people, because these are heroes of American history who to many people will be utterly unknown.
Well, I think the most important one you mentioned was Frank Kameny, who was the first openly gay person fired by the federal government to actually challenge his firing. And he was in the Army Map Service, which was sort of the early version of the Geospatial Intelligence Agency. He was an astronomer, Harvard educated, a World War II veteran. And he was fired in 1957. And, thousands of people before him had been fired for the same offense, just for being gay. But they had all been anonymous and they'd all kind of slunk away and disappeared because as we talked about earlier, there was no worse thing than to be gay. He actually brought suit against the federal government. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. His case was rejected. It wasn't heard by the Supreme Court. But he then devoted the rest of his life to fighting for gay rights and gay equality. And I actually got to meet him. He died in 2011, but I actually got to know him a little bit in his later years. And in 2009, just 2 years before he died, the federal government, it was like the early months of or the summer maybe of the first Obama administration, and the same federal agency that had fired him actually issued a formal apology to him. And Michelle Obama was there. So that was also one of the inspirations for this book, was attending that ceremony and sort of thinking to myself, wow, like here is a story that starts, in the 1950s, and it really goes earlier. And you can just see this amazing arc that ends up now to where we are today, when gay people are, free to work in any sort of government job, and there's no prohibition on what they can do. And how many other thousands of people, who we don't know about. And I found some of them in the book, and I can't really say much because the book doesn't come out until May, but I found some incredible stories. I found a very close aide to Lyndon Johnson, who was treated like a son by Johnson, whose life was basically ruined because he was gay. And I found this story in a declassified FBI file. And there's so many other stories like this. I mean, this book could have been, 10 volumes. And I hope that other historians do the research, because so much of this history was secret and it's all hidden away, and it's hard to find.
One of the tragic aspects of this is no sooner had the kind of legal and social pressure begun to ease in the 1980s than we had the AIDS epidemic, and this gave a sort of extra tragic vortex to what had previously one could have seen as perhaps an encouraging arc going from persecution to acceptance.
Yes, and there's a lot about the AIDS epidemic in the book, obviously, about the Reagan administration. And I actually think it might be the most interesting part of the book, actually, is the Reagan era, because one of the other things I found or elaborate on is sort of the degree to which the Reagans had been sort of surrounded by gay men, going back to their years in Hollywood. They were both actors, obviously, Ronald and Nancy. And Nancy especially just had a circle of gay friends around her, and, her hairstylist and her clothing designers and her best friends that she would talk with on the phone. And Reagan also, the President Reagan too, was friends with Rock Hudson, the actor, who was really the first celebrity to die of AIDS in 1985. And it's such a tragedy that the sort of lack of response of the Reagan administration to the AIDS epidemic. President Reagan didn't mention the word AIDS until 1985, which was 4 years after the disease was first identified. I mean, can you imagine a prime minister or a president not mentioning the word COVID until 4 years after? Maybe in your country it's more imaginable than in ours, but
almost everything, unfortunately, is imaginable in British politics right now, which is why I'm given up my job to run for Parliament and try and change it. But I think that the thing that really, I mean, your final conclusion, your concluding chapter, draws some very powerful, big lessons from this sort of microcosm of the story of gay Washington, and of course it comes at a time when we are in the middle of a new culture wars and the whole sort of wokery discussion and cancel culture. And you say that the people you write about in the book would have been absolutely shocked and delighted at the way in which Washington has transformed in recent years, to the point of deep acceptance. I wonder what they would have also thought of the culture wars that are going on at the moment.
Yes, I say in the book that I think the story of the Secret City is really an embodiment or a validation of sort of the old-fashioned American values of pluralism and tolerance and free expression. Because if you think of the trajectory of gay people in America during the time period that I examined in the book, from the 1930s to the turn of the century, you're looking at one of the most dramatic social changes in American history for the better. I mean, when I start the book, gay people are medically pathologized, they are legally criminalized, and they're basically ignored and they're written out of existence. And yet today it is now a completely positive change, and it came about through openness. It came about through expression and conversation. And it used to be you couldn't even say the word homosexual. They wouldn't even print it in the newspaper. It was always referred to as a, perversion, or the crime that did, the love that dare not speak its name, right? I mean, that's how, and then that totally changed. It took a long time, but it changed. And I think we're hearing a lot of sort of negative stories about history now, that things haven't improved, that they're worse than they've ever been. And I think that this story, at least, is a positive one, and it's something to be proud about. And it's not perfect, obviously. There's still discrimination, and I'm not going to deny that that doesn't still happen. But I think we should be able to acknowledge the positive change that has occurred, and also to acknowledge why it has occurred.
Thanks so much, Jamie, for sharing your thoughts. And the book is out in May. This is what one might call a sneak preview of some of the elements of it. We look forward very much to seeing you in London, and it's also been a great pleasure over many years having you as an ally against the Kremlin, and we look forward to your continued support in that fight too. And we wish you every success with the sale and promotion of your book and all the other causes that we both support. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ed. Good luck.